Imagine a dog so fiercely bred for war that his own master intentionally mutilates him.
Right. Just a really brutal image to start us off.
It really is. We are talking about this young, handsome mastiff. He's incredibly proud of his appearance, and then he wakes up one morning to find his master pinning him down and barbarously slicing off his long, drooping, beautiful ears.
Which just sounds completely backwards, even horrific.
Exactly. Why would destroying a piece of yourself, like actually stripping away your physical presence, make you untouchable?
So today, we are going deep into this. We are tearing down the illusion of armor in this deep dive.
And it's such a fascinating topic. That brutal image is drawn straight from the 17th century fables of Jean de La Fontaine, but it perfectly encapsulates the mission for our deep dive today. We spend our entire lives convinced that building thick walls makes us safe.
Oh, we all do it. I mean, you get a good job, you lock in this rigid 5-year plan, you build up your emotional defenses.
Right, you establish this very set, predictable identity. Yeah, and you point to that structure and think, I am secure. Look at this massive fortress I've built.
But when you actually look through the vast, sweeping history of human strategy, philosophy, and even biological evolution that we are examining today, well, that fortress suddenly looks remarkably like a trap.
A total trap.
Exactly. The core premise we are unpacking is that having a definitive, predictable form, having a highly visible plan or heavy armor, is actually a massive vulnerability. We're looking at why adapting the fluid, ungraspable nature of water is really the ultimate strategy for survival and power.
Okay, let's unpack this using that mastiff jeller. Because, well, the psychology of this fable is just fascinating.
It really is.
Initially, Jowler is absolutely devastated. He thinks, like, what crime have I committed to be mutilated by my own master? How can I even show my face among my friends?
Right. He feels completely victimized. His identity is ruined.
Totally ruined.
Which, is the most natural human reaction imaginable. Whenever a part of our identity is stripped away or our perceived defenses are compromised, we feel exposed. We feel humiliated. We just assume we have been weakened.
But then Jowler grows up, and he starts doing what mastiffs do. He gets into scraps.
Right.
He fights other dogs. He defends the property against wolves. And he comes to this really profound, life-altering realization. In a brutal, close-quarters fight, a long, floppy ear isn't a beautiful feature.
Not at all. It is a massive liability.
Yeah. It is literally a handle for your enemy to grab onto, to pull you down, to tear you apart.
Precisely.
And because Jowler has practically no ears left, he comes home from these vicious fights without those lacerations. He throws on a spiked collar, and suddenly, a wolf attacking him is completely puzzled.
The wolf is circling, snapping, but there is just nothing to grab.
Exactly. Jowler becomes invincible, specifically because he lacks surface area.
It's the tactical advantage of having less to defend. The source material highlights this as a foundational principle, right? The less we leave others to lay hold of, the better.
That makes so much sense.
When you construct a massive identity, when your pride is deeply tied to rigid routines or inflexible beliefs or a highly specific public image, you are basically walking around with metaphorical, long, floppy ears.
Oh, wow. That's a great way to put it.
You are giving the world endless points of leverage to use against you. Accidents, criticisms, attacks, they all suddenly have a surface to latch onto.
But wait, I have to ask about the underlying logic here. It seems like such a dark way to view the world, this idea of addition by subtraction. Is the argument really that making yourself smaller or having less substance to your outward identity inherently generates strength?
Well, it is less about being small and more about being ungraspable. And we see this validated not just in human philosophy, but in the literal bedrock of life on Earth.
Wait, really? Like in nature?
Oh, absolutely. The materials we are looking at bring in the work of E.W. Barnes, who analyzed the scientific history of survival. If you look at the evolution of species, the development of heavy protective armor has almost universally spelled absolute disaster.
See, that is wild to me. When you picture a heavily armored dinosaur, like an ankylosaurus or some massive, thick-shelled creature, your immediate instinct is, that animal is safe. Nothing is getting through that.
It is a super compelling illusion, but Barnes points out that organisms have experimented with countless survival strategies over millions of years, right?
Right.
Some rely on concealment, blending into the background. Some rely on swift flight. Some develop toxic counterattacks or unite in massive cooperative groups. But the most seductive and ultimately the most fatal evolutionary path is the attempts to encase oneself in bony plates, heavy spines, and impenetrable shells.
Why fatal, though? I mean, if the shell stops the teeth, shouldn't the armored animal win out over time?
Because of the hidden cost of the armor itself, heavily armored creatures are making a devastating biological trade-off. They are sacrificing mobility for safety.
I see.
Carrying around all that bone and thick plating requires an immense amount of energy, and it makes the creature incredibly unwieldy. They lose their agility completely.
So they can't move around easily.
Right, and because they are so heavy and slow, they cannot actively hunt or forage across wide, changing terrains. They are forced to rely almost entirely on low-energy, easily accessible vegetable food.
So they basically trap themselves in a metabolic prison. They build this massive wall to keep the predators out, but the wall is so heavy they can barely move, which means they can't eat high-energy food, which makes them even slower.
Exactly. A literal downward spiral of evolutionary stagnation. Now compare them to their unarmored foes. Fast-moving predators don't have the luxury of a shell.
Right, they have to be quick.
So they have to develop acute senses, faster nervous systems, superior agility. They live on rapidly profitable, high-energy animal food.
And the environment is always changing, right?
Always. Climates change, food sources move, the agile predator adapts. But the heavily armored creature just lumbers around, slower and slower, unable to change its form to meet the new environment, until it just goes the way of the brontosaurus.
Wow.
Barnes concludes that this repeated failure of armor proves a really profound point. Mind triumphs over mere matter. Fast, unpredictable, unarmored movement outsmarts static, heavy defense every single time.
Think about how perfectly that applies to the listener, right? To the rigid systems we build today.
Oh, definitely.
Let's say you are in a career and you carve out this hyper-specific niche. You refuse to learn the new software. You ignore the changing industry trends, all because you feel safe in the little walled garden you've built.
Or think about a relationship where someone puts up massive emotional walls to never get hurt.
Right. In the short term, you are inside the shell. It feels safe. The teeth aren't piercing the skin. But long term, you've lost your agility. You are a slow-moving target in an environment that is constantly always changing.
And the real tragedy is that the heavier the armor, the blinder you become to the shifting world outside.
Yeah, you just can't see it.
And if that metabolic cost of armor destroys an individual animal, imagine what it does when an entire civilization tries to employ the same strategy. The sources provide this masterful historical analysis of this by comparing two of the most famous city-states in ancient history.
Sparta and Athens.
Exactly.
The contrast here is staggering. Let's look at the 8th century BC. Sparta had this massive logistical problem. They were geographically isolated, surrounded by mountains, landlocked, but their population was expanding. They needed agricultural land.
Right, a classic resource problem.
Most Greek city-states solved this by taking to the sea and setting up colonies elsewhere. But Sparta decided to stay put and just turn on their neighbor.
You just attacked them.
Yeah, they launched these brutal, grinding conflicts over decades and conquered an immense area of the Peloponnese. But solving their land problem created a terrifying demographic nightmare. The people they subjugated, known as the Helots, suddenly outnumbered the Spartan citizens 10-1.
Just try to conceptualize the sheer paranoia of that existence.
Insane.
You are a society sitting on top of a demographic powder keg. The people growing your food, maintaining your infrastructure, the people you have literally enslaved, outnumber your own families 10-1.
You'd be terrified all the time.
You are living in a constant, suffocating state of fear, anticipating a horrific, coordinated revenge.
So Sparta's solution was to turn their entire culture into a living, breathing fortress. They became the ultimate armored dinosaur. To police this massive horde of helots, they engineered a society completely obsessed with the status quo.
The details in the sources are really chilling.
They really are. At age 7, a Spartan boy was taken from his mother and placed in a brutal military club. Their lives were stripped of any comfort whatsoever. They slept on beds woven from river reeds.
And they were issued exactly one outer garment to wear for the entire year, regardless of the winter cold.
Right, and if a child was deemed weak at birth, they were literally left to die in a cavern in the mountains.
They systematically purged their society of anything fluid, anything creative, or anything that might distract from physical warfare.
No art, right?
Exactly. There was no poetry, no theater, no music. The subjugated slaves did all the necessary crafts and agriculture. And most crucially, the Spartan leadership completely banned the use of money in trade.
Right. No money at all.
None. They fundamentally believed that if their citizens acquired wealth, it would introduce selfish desires. which would lead to dissension and ultimately weaken their rigid, unified warrior discipline.
They built a perfect shell. And, to be fair to the Spartans, as a localized defense mechanism, it worked phenomenally well for a long time.
Oh, it was incredibly effective at first.
They forged the most terrifying and powerful infantry the ancient world had ever seen. Their phalanxes were legendary. These walls of bronze and spears that moved in terrifying mechanical unison, they could vanquish armies many times their size.
But they had absolutely zero interest in expanding their culture or exploring the world or adapting their ideas.
None at all. Their only goal was to hold on to the land they had and keep the helots crushed underfoot. They were essentially a turtle that had pulled his head and legs entirely inside its shell, sitting completely motionless for decades.
Meanwhile, just across the peninsula, Athens was rising to equal prominence, but they took the exact opposite approach. Athens embraced the fluid nature of the sea.
Here were sailors and merchants.
Right, they became master navigators and traders. Their currency, the famous silver owl coins, flowed throughout the entire Mediterranean, touching different cultures, absorbing new ideas.
They were constantly changing.
Exactly. The Athenians were a society in a state of consummate flux. When a problem arose, they didn't rely on rigid dogma. They adapted to the occasion. They invented new social structures, philosophy, unprecedented art forms. They were the water to Sparta's stone.
And inevitably, the stone and the water clash. In 431 BC, this massive ideological and military tension erupts into the Peloponnesian War. It is a grueling, brutal, generation-defining conflict that drags on for 27 years. It totally drains both societies.
What's fascinating here is that in the end, the Spartan war machine, that supposedly unbreakable phalanx, actually emerges victorious.
Sparta actually wins the war. Athens surrenders. But the incredible irony that the source material point out is that this victory was the absolute worst thing that could have ever happened to Sparta.
It forces us to ask a deeply counterintuitive question. How does total victory destroy the victor?
Now, how does that work?
The answer lies in the nature of their armor. By winning, Sparta suddenly found itself commanding a vast empire. They were no longer just policing their own localized helots. They now had to manage and govern a sprawling network of conquered Athenian territories and overseas allies.
They're a tip outside the shell.
Exactly. They could no longer stay hidden behind their mountains. If they retreated to their shell, the Athenians and their allies would simply regroup and rebel. So Sparta was forced out of its controlled environment and into a highly complex, fluid, politically nuanced world.
And they had absolutely no tools to understand it.
None.
And the really fascinating mechanism here is that it wasn't a reorganized Athenian military that broke the Spartans. It was Athenian money.
The corrosive power of wealth. Money is inherently chaotic. It acts exactly like water. It flows into every crack, seeking every opportunity. It cannot be controlled or forced to march in a straight line.
And the Spartans had zero defense for that.
Right. They had spent centuries training to march in perfect unison with a heavy shield. They had zero training in economics, diplomacy, or the nuances of political influence.
Think about these Spartan governors. These are men who were raised, sleeping on reeds, wearing one cloak a year, taught that suffering was the highest virtue. And suddenly, they are sent to rule these incredibly wealthy Athenian outposts.
It was a culture shock they couldn't survive.
They are surrounded by merchants, luxury goods, bribes, and complex economic markets. The Spartan system had never inoculated them against temptation because it had simply banned temptation altogether.
It's like an autoimmune system that has never been exposed to a single germ because the person lived in a sterile plastic bubble. The moment the bubble pops, the system is overwhelmed.
The corruption was rapid and devastating. These austere Spartan generals and governors succumbed to the worst excesses. They hoarded wealth, they took bribes, they abandoned their discipline.
The fluid, chaotic Athenian way of life seeped right into the rigid Spartan structure and rusted their armor from the inside out. The society back home began to fracture as wealth inequality suddenly appeared in a culture that had demanded absolute uniformity. Athens, on the other hand, lost its empire but easily adapted its form. They transitioned seamlessly into being an educational, cultural, and economic hub. They continued to thrive.
But Sparta was utterly confused by this change in their status quo. Their rigidity meant they couldn't reform their laws or integrate new ideas to manage their new empire. They just grew weaker, more corrupt, more hollow.
It happened so fast, too.
Yeah, a mere 30 years after achieving their greatest victory over Athens, this supposedly invincible warrior society lost a battle to the city-state of Thebes and collapsed completely. They never recovered. The armor didn't just fail, the armor became the actual mechanism of their death.
That historical collapse bridges perfectly into how conflict evolved as humanity moved forward. If we leap from the physical clash of ancient bronze phalanxes to the warfare of the 20th century, we see this exact same dynamic rigidity versus fluidity play out again.
But the terrain shifts.
Exactly. It moves from the physical geography of mountains and seas into the abstract psychological realm. The sources detail a fascinating conflict where formlessness completely dismantled technical, numerical, and structural superiority.
Let's jump to post-WWII China. And just to be clear to the listener, we are maintaining absolute neutrality here. We are focusing purely on the strategic maneuvers described in the text, analyzing military tactics, not endorsing any political ideologies.
Right, we're just looking at the architecture of the conflict as the source presents it.
So looking at the logistics, the contrast in military philosophies is astounding. You have the Chinese nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, facing off against the Chinese communists, led by Mao Tse-tung. By every traditional metric, the nationalists should have easily won.
Oh, on paper, it wasn't even close.
They had overwhelming superior firepower, they controlled all the major infrastructure in cities, and their leadership was heavily trained in Western military doctrine. Chiang Kai-shek was a devout follower of Karl von Clausewitz, the famous Prussian military theorist.
Who viewed war as a linear, decisive clash of forces.
Right. You find the enemy's center of gravity, you bring your biggest guns, and you crush it.
A very structural, architectural view of conflict. Following that doctrine, Chiang Kai-shek committed his best, most well-equipped forces to Manchuria. His strategy was super straightforward. Sweep into the region, occupy the major cities, secure the communication lines, and assume the communists would either stand and be annihilated or simply collapse from losing the urban centers.
And at first, that traditional plan seemed flawless. The nationalists rolled in and easily occupied the major Manchurian cities. But the communist response completely baffled the Western trained commanders.
They didn't do what was expected.
Not at all. Instead of defending the cities or even setting up defensive perimeters around them, the communists just dispersed. They melted away into the most remote, mountainous, out-of-the-way corners of the region. They essentially retreated into space that the nationalists considered completely useless from a strategic standpoint.
To a commander trained by Clausewitz, retreating into useless terrain without forcing a battle looks like cowardice. Or just total strategic incompetence.
But it wasn't.
No. The sources reveal a deeply calculated, highly sophisticated pattern at play, one rooted in an entirely different philosophy of conflict. To understand it, the text uses a brilliant analogy, contrasting the fundamental nature of the Western game of chess with the Asian game of Go, which is known as wei-chi.
I love this breakdown because it makes the abstract strategies so tangible. Think about how you play chess. The board is relatively confined, right? 64 squares.
Very tight space.
And the gameplay is strictly linear and position-oriented. It is highly aggressive. You meet force with force. You fight violently to control the center squares of the board because that gives you dominance.
The entire goal is singular and direct. Trap and kill the opponent's king. Every move is geared toward forcing a decisive, head-on confrontation.
Now look at the architecture of wei-chi, or Go. The board is a massive grid of 361 intersections. It is nearly 6 times the size of a chessboard, providing vastly more open space.
And the pieces aren't diverse units with different powers, like in chess.
Right. They are simple black and white stones placed on the board one at a time. The gameplay is profoundly nonlinear. The goal in Go isn't to violently strike down the opponent's king in a direct clash.
The objective is to secure territory by isolating the opponent's stones, encircling them, and gradually inducing a kind of structural paralysis.
You aren't fighting to hold a specific entrenched position in the center. You are fighting for mobility. You spread your stones out into the empty space, creating abstract patterns. And Mao, as the text notes, was an absolute fanatic for wei-chi. He deeply ingrained the precepts of the game into his military doctrine. He explicitly instructed his forces to break apart and throw themselves into what he called a jigsaw pattern.
That jigsaw pattern is the pure tactical application of formlessness. By dispersing into the vast, seemingly useless space surrounding the nationalist-held cities, the communist forces slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to encircle them.
And the nationalists couldn't engage them.
Exactly. If Chiang Kai-shek tried to act dynamically, say, sending an army out from one city to reinforce another, the fluid, dispersed communist units wouldn't meet them in a pitched battle. They would simply flow around the rescuing army, harass its flanks, and isolate it in the open. They systematically severed the lines of supply. They cut the telegraph and communication lines.
The nationalists had all these heavy artillery pieces and superior weapons, but they were effectively paralyzed.
Yeah.
I mean, what good is a massive cannon if you don't know where the enemy is, and every time you march out to find them, they dissolve into the countryside?
They were trapped inside their own armor, inside the cities.
It's incredible.
Furthermore, the texts emphasize that this encirclement was not purely physical, it was deeply psychological. The jigsaw pattern was designed to encircle the enemy's brain.
Encircle the brain. That's an intense phrase.
Because the nationalists were blind and isolated, the fast-moving, vaporous enemy could pour in from all sides at unpredictable times, utilizing intense psychological warfare and propaganda. The nationalist soldiers were sitting behind massive stone walls, completely terrified of an elusive threat they couldn't see or measure.
The tension must have been unbearable.
It shattered their morale. The technically superior army essentially surrendered in their own minds long before the physical cities ever fell. They were defeated by an opponent that fundamentally refused to take a solid, targetable form.
This strategy of refusing contact, of weaponizing empty space, is a recurring nightmare for conventional armies. The sources provide other incredible historical echoes of this.
Like in World War II.
Yeah, look at General Erwin Rommel in North Africa. The text describes him operating in a forbidding sea of sand. Rommel looked at the desert and realized that traditional European military formalism would be fatal there.
The desert, much like the ocean, offers no natural defensive structures. No mountains to anchor a flank, no rivers to hold the line. Rommel completely shunned the idea of fixed plans.
And his commanders hated that, right?
Oh, the high command in Berlin kept trying to hamstring him with rigid orders, demanding he hold specific coordinates or follow pre-approved timelines. Rommel largely disregarded them.
Good for him.
He made no fixed operational plans beyond the initial clash of armor. He relied on lightning-fast, improvisational decisions, tailoring his tactics minute by minute to the specific situations as they unfolded. He ruptured the British lines repeatedly because he treated the desert not as land to be held, but as a fluid ocean to be navigated.
And perhaps the most poetic execution of this is T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. The source material points out how Lawrence pioneered what he termed the War of Detachment.
That's a great concept.
He was tasked with leading the disparate Arab rebel forces against the sprawling Ottoman Turkish Empire. The Turks had modern artillery, machine guns, and operated in traditional, entrenched formations. If Lawrence had tried to gather the Arab tribes into a conventional army and march on a Turkish stronghold, they would have been absolutely slaughtered.
So Lawrence inverted the paradigm. He realized that fighting wars of contact against a superior force was mathematically unjustifiable. Instead, he decided his forces would become the silent threat of a vast, unknown desert.
He weaponized the emptiness.
Exactly. His units blended entirely into the harsh landscape. They never collected together in one large, targetable mass. They would strike a railway line, blow up a train, and instantly vanish back into the dunes.
They never provided a target. The Turks exhausted themselves, burning through immense resources and manpower, scrambling around the scorching desert trying to fight a vaporous ghost army. They had to spread their forces dangerously thin just to protect thousands of miles of empty track.
Lawrence destroyed the morale and logistical capacity of the Turkish army without ever giving them a solid anvil to strike against.
So we ask you, the listener, to consider the conflicts in your own lives. When a problem arises at work or a tense disagreement flares up in your family, what is your default posture? Are you perpetually playing a linear game of chess?
Do you immediately meet force with force, locking horns, trying to dominate the argument and crush the opponent's position?
Or can you play Go? Can you utilize the vast psychological space around the problem? Instead of screaming back, can you withdraw, diffuse the immediate tension, encircle the core issue with questions, and exhaust the other person's anger without ever engaging in a direct, destructive fight?
Can you win by refusing to be a solid target for their frustration?
Applying that level of agility requires immense discipline, and it naturally leads us to explore the greatest vulnerabilities of this strategy. If achieving formlessness requires open space, rapid adaptability, and a lack of ego, what destroys it?
What are the traps that drag us back into heavy armor? The historical texts point to two specific fatal errors: the arrogance of bloated size and the romanticism of clinging to the past.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's tackle the trap of size first, because this is something our modern culture gets entirely wrong.
We are so conditioned to believe that bigger is inherently better.
Always. You want a bigger company with more employees, a bigger budget, bigger house, a more massive presence. But in both biological evolution and military strategy, Largeness is very frequently the first step toward extinction, and the text provides an epic cinematic example of this. King Xerxes of Persia, deciding to invade Greece in 483 BC.
The scale of this invasion was staggering. Xerxes managed to assemble what was widely believed to be the largest military force in human history up to that point. The ancient historian Herodotus estimated the Persian forces at over 5 million men.
Which is just an unfathomable number.
Even if modern historians scale that number down, it was an unimaginably massive, overwhelming force. The logistical plan was audacious. Build a pontoon bridge across the Hellespont to march the sea of humanity into Greece, while an equally massive Persian navy sailed along the coast to pin the much smaller Greek fleets in their harbors. On paper, it was mathematically impossible for the fractured Greek city-states to survive.
But Xerxes has this advisor, a man named Artabanus. And Artabanus looks at this endless horizon of soldiers and ships, and he goes to the king and says, "I have grave misgivings. The two mightiest powers in the world are against you."
And Xerxes laughs at him.
Right. He essentially calls his advisor a coward. He looks at his millions of soldiers and asks, what earthly powers could possibly match this army? And Artabanus replies, the land and the sea.
It is a brilliant, terrifying realization of logistics and form. Artabanus understood that extreme size intrinsically destroys mobility. It creates vulnerabilities that cannot be defended. Let's look at the Navy. The Persian fleet was so gargantuan that there was literally no natural harbor on the Greek coastline large enough to safely receive it.
Which means when the sudden, violent Mediterranean storms blew in, the ships couldn't take shelter.
They were totally exposed.
They were exposed to the elements, and a massive portion of the fleet was simply smashed to kindling against the rocks by the weather.
Precisely. The sea itself destroyed them because their size demanded an infrastructure that didn't exist. And on land, the immense army faced an even grimmer reality. A force of that magnitude is a slow-moving, bloated behemoth that must constantly consume resources just to survive.
An army of millions literally drinks small rivers dry as they pass. They strip the land bare of every crop, every animal, every grain of wheat like a plague of locusts.
They were so massive they outpaced their own ability to bring up supplies.
Artabanus' prediction came entirely true. The army began to starve because it consumed the very land it marched upon. They crawled along, weak and desperate, while the vastly smaller, agile Greek forces used the narrow geography and deceptive maneuvers to completely disorient and dismantle them.
Xerxes suffered an incomprehensible disaster, not because he lacked power, but because he sacrificed mobility for the illusion of size.
And the principle holds true across all disciplines, right? The more gigantic the entity, whether it's a dinosaur, an ancient army, or a modern multinational corporation, the easier it is to induce a collapse.
Absolutely. A massive bureaucracy cannot pivot. It cannot adapt to sudden shifts in the economic weather. It requires so much energy just to sustain its own mass that it suffocates itself.
But alongside the physical trap of size, the sources identify a second, more psychological enemy of formlessness: age. Specifically, the rigid adherence to the past that so often infects people and institutions as they get older. The text introduces this through a concept from the Chinese philosopher Han Fei-Tzu, writing in the 3rd century BC.
Han Fei-Tzu's story of the Man of Sung is a remarkably dry, insightful piece of philosophical comedy. It perfectly illustrates the absurdity of relying on past precedent to solve current problems.
The story goes like this. There was a farmer in the state of Sung out tilling his field one day. In the middle of this field, there happens to be a solid tree trunk. Suddenly, a hare comes sprinting furiously across the field, blindly smashes headfirst into the tree trunk, breaks its neck, and dies on the spot.
Just a total freak accident.
A complete anomaly. But for the farmer, it's a free dinner. He didn't have to hunt. He didn't have to set a snare. But observe the farmer's reaction. He throws his plow aside, walks over, sits down next to the tree trunk, and spends the rest of his natural life just watching the wood, hoping another hare will blindly crash into it.
He abandons the dynamic work of tilling his field in favor of waiting for a statistical anomaly to repeat itself.
And he never catches another hare.
Never. He becomes the laughingstock of his village. Han Fei-Tzu uses this parable to critique governance and power. The philosophical argument is that if you attempt to govern the complex, shifting people of the present age using the exact policies and moralities of the early kings, or on a personal level, if you try to manage your current relationships or business using the exact methods that brought you a lucky success 10 years ago, you are doing exactly what the man watching the tree trunk is doing.
You are sitting in an empty field, hoping for a freak accident of history to happen twice. And what's really piercing about this section of the text is how it highlights the optics of this rigidity. When powerful people lose their adaptability and cling to the past, they don't just become ineffective, they actually become comical.
They become relics.
Yeah, the source points to the late 18th century court of France,
Yeah.
specifically Marie Antoinette and King Louis VI.
The environment around them was shifting radically. Enlightenment ideas were spreading, the economy was collapsing, the peasantry was starving, and the democratic tide was rising rapidly.
And how did the monarchy react to this unprecedented fluid crisis? They retreated into their shell. They grew hopelessly, obsessively tied to rigid court formality.
They doubled down on the rules of how many steps you take when bowing, who gets to hand the king his shirt in the morning, the exact dimensions of aristocratic wigs.
It's just absurd.
The average French citizen, dealing with the brutal reality of starvation, looked at these elaborate, unchanging court rituals and didn't see divine majesty. They saw a silly, out-of-touch relic. It was a massive depreciation of a centuries-old institution.
Instead of adapting to the shifting political winds, they grew more rigid in their adherence to the past, and that rigidity greased the wheels of the revolution that sent them to the guillotine.
We see the exact same fatal rigidity in King Charles I of England in the 1630s. The political landscape was changing, democratic pressures were mounting, and Charles reacted by trying to turn the clock back.
He disbanded Parliament.
He demanded strict adherence to petty protocols and ancient royal prerogatives. He wanted to rule in the older, absolute style of his predecessors. He tried to force a fluid, evolving society into an outdated, rigid mold. It sparked a horrific civil war, and he too ended up losing his head to the executioner's axe.
I want to challenge this idea for a moment, though, because in our daily lives, we are constantly instructed to do the exact opposite. We are told to respect tradition. We are told to study historical precedent, to, read the room based on how corporate culture has always operated.
Sure, that's conventional wisdom.
The elder statesman, the veteran employee, they are supposed to be wise precisely because they know how things were done in the past. Are the sources genuinely suggesting that we should just throw out all the rules, ignore the past completely, and constantly reinvent the wheel?
The texts are remarkably uncompromising on this point. While understanding history is useful, relying on it as a blueprint is fatal. You cannot let other people's ideas or even your own past successes dictate your future forms.
Interesting.
The source quotes Napoleon Bonaparte, a master of battlefield improvisation, who stated flatly, "The laws that govern circumstances are abolished by new circumstances."
That is a brilliant way to frame it. The rules literally vanish when the environment changes.
Exactly. You must gauge every new situation, every new conflict, with completely fresh eyes. The text actually advises the reader to be brutal with the past, especially your own past.
With your own past.
Yes. If you show too much reverence for the old philosophies foisted upon you, or if you refuse to abandon a strategy that worked for you in your 20s now that you are in your 40s, you take on a form that is no longer organic to your current reality, you become entirely predictable.
And predictability is dangerous.
Predictability, the text notes, is the first definitive sign of decrepitude. Clinging to past glory makes you look like a cadaver mimicking youth.
A cadaver mimicking youth. That is a haunting image.
Yeah.
It brings to mind the aging rock star who refuses to change his act, or the company that keeps trying to sell a product nobody wants anymore just because it was their flagship 30 years ago. So we've analyzed grand armies, biological evolution, and doomed monarchs. But how does this scale down to the psychological level? How do you, the listener, actually apply the philosophy of formlessness to your own internal character, your interpersonal dynamics, your everyday workplace?
The transition from historical strategy to personal psychology in our sources is anchored deeply in the work of the psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich. Reich explored a concept he called character armor, which maps perfectly onto our discussion of physical defenses.
Okay, character armor.
Reich observed that as the human ego develops from childhood, it is continually subjected to intense conflicts between its own instinctual inner needs and a harsh, fear-inducing outer world.
Right, the world constantly tells you no. You get punished for expressing certain emotions, people betray your trust, you face rejection, the environment strikes you.
And in response to these repeated, painful blows, the ego naturally undergoes a structural change. It acquires a chronic, automatically functioning mode of reaction. It builds a hard psychological shell.
It armors up.
Reich defines this rigidification as the person's character. It is quite literally an armoring of the personality, a set of defensive emotional reflexes designed to deflect the blows of the outer world and manage anxiety.
And on a basic survival level, it works. I mean, if you build a wall of cynicism, or if you adopt a persona of aggressive hypercompetence, you become less sensitive to the unpleasure of rejection. You don't get hurt as easily because you don't let anything in.
It absolutely reduces unpleasure. But Reich argues that it comes at a catastrophic cost to the individual's vitality. He states that this armoring severely restricts the person's libidinal and aggressive motility.
Let's break down that terminology. Motility in biology refers to the ability to move fluidly and spontaneously, so psychological motility.
Is your emotional and intellectual agility? When you are heavily armored, your capacity for spontaneous joy, for creative achievement, for genuine, flexible connection with others is paralyzed.
You're stuck in the shell.
The ego becomes rigid, just like the Spartan society or the heavily pleated dinosaur. You survive the blows, yes, but you are trapped in an energy stasis. You lose the dynamic vitality of formlessness. You react to new, potentially wonderful situations with the same rigid, defensive posture you developed to survive past trauma.
So bringing this into practical application, the sources suggest that the first psychological requirement of formlessness is incredibly challenging. You must train yourself to take nothing personally. You must eradicate outward defensiveness.
Because defensiveness immediately reveals your form. It reveals exactly where you are vulnerable.
Think about it in a workplace setting. If a colleague makes a subtle dig at your presentation and you instantly flush red, get offensive, and start justifying yourself, what have you just done?
You've given them a target.
You have drawn a bright neon circle around your Achilles heel. You have told everyone in the room, this is my ego. This is where I am weak. Your opponents will realize they've hit a nerve, and if they're strategic, they will hit that exact spot again and again.
The text advises that you have to be like a slippery ball that cannot be held. Make your face a formless mask. If you show no reaction, if you don't take the attack personally, it absolutely infuriates and disorientates people who are trying to manipulate you. They are swinging at vapor.
A perfect historical embodiment of this psychological formlessness, this refusal to present a rigid ego to a hostile world, is Baron James Rothschild.
Oh, his story is incredible.
He was a wealthy German Jew living in Paris during the 19th century. He was operating in a culture that was deeply prejudiced and decidedly unfriendly to foreign influence. Yet he didn't just survive. He expanded his massive banking empire through an astonishing series of violent, hostile regime changes.
The history of France during his lifetime is just endless whiplash. Let's trace how he navigated this. First, he is operating under the Restoration monarchy of Louis VIII. This is a stiffly formal, highly aristocratic, deeply conservative environment.
A rigid person would have clashed with it.
But Rothschild just smoothed his edges, adopted the manners of the court, and blended in. Then, that monarchy falls, and in comes the bourgeois, more commercially minded reign of Louis Philippe.
And Rothschild seamlessly adapts. He shifts his public persona to align with the new, pragmatic business elite. But then the environment violently erupts again. The Democratic Revolution of 1848 sweeps across France. Barricades in the streets, the monarchy overthrown, a rising tide of socialist sentiment that is intensely hostile to massive wealth and banking dynasties.
This is where most rigid, wealthy families were absolutely ruined. They clung to their aristocratic titles, they tried to fund counter-revolutions, they openly defied the new republic, they showed a rigid form, and they were crushed by the mob or exiled.
But Rothschild did not take the revolution's attacks on wealth personally. He didn't let his ego lock him into a doomed aristocratic defense. Instead, he made a calculated, formless pivot.
It was brilliant.
He quietly donated massive sums to the new Republican government. He opened his mansions to be used as hospitals for wounded revolutionaries. He dressed down. He presented himself not as an aloof aristocrat, but as a necessary, pragmatic financial manager for the new state.
And then, when that republic eventually fell and the upstart Louis Napoleon crowned himself emperor, Rothschild pivoted yet again, accepting the new imperial reality without a blink.
He survived 4 wildly different, highly volatile political climates because outwardly, he never showed a solid, unchangeable form. The text notes that his contemporaries might have despised him, calling him hypocritical, opportunistic, or lacking in moral loyalty.
But he didn't care about their labels.
No. His currency was survival and financial power, not maintaining a rigid political identity that would look good on a tombstone.
This fluid, deeply pragmatic style of navigating power is highlighted in the sources through a fascinating gender analysis. Historically, this elusive style of ruling has been most masterfully practiced by queens who reigned alone.
because the environment they operated in demanded it. A queen ruling in her own right, historically, is a woman operating in a fiercely male-dominated patriarchal sphere. Her subjects, her nobles, her foreign rivals are constantly scrutinizing her, doubting her ability to rule simply because of her gender.
It creates an impossible double bind. If a queen openly favors one side in a political or religious struggle, the male establishment immediately dismisses her as being overly emotional or acting out of feminine attachment.
Right.
But if she attempts to overcompensate by repressing all emotion and playing the heavy-handed, rigid, authoritarian dictator in a traditional male fashion, she arouses even worse, more vitriolic criticism. She cannot win by playing the traditional, rigid games of force.
So to survive, she has to evolve an improvisatory, highly flexible style. Queen Elizabeth of England is the quintessential example of this. She inherited a country tearing itself apart in incredibly violent, bloody struggles between Catholics and Protestants.
If she had taken a rigid, absolutist stance on either side, she would have plunged the nation into a catastrophic civil war and likely been assassinated.
Instead, she steered a masterfully elusive middle course. She kept everyone guessing. She entertained marriage proposals from foreign Catholic princes, dangling the possibility of an alliance only to withdraw at the last moment.
She made vague promises to Protestant factions without committing to radical reforms.
She avoided rigid treaties that would lock her into one side of a continental war. She just kept shifting, kept adapting, refusing to present a clear ideological target, keeping the country at peace long enough for it to become an economic and naval superpower.
And Catherine the Great of Russia took this psychological formlessness to a level of absolute genius. Think about her situation. She wasn't even Russian. She was a minor German princess. She deposes her husband, Tsar Peter III, takes sole control of the massive Russian Empire, and no one in Europe thought she could possibly survive.
But she governed with no preconceived, rigid theories of how a czar must act. She didn't try to force a German system onto a Russian populace. Instead, she made it her primary business to constantly read Russia's changing, volatile moods.
She observed the deep cultural currents. She famously said, "One must govern in such a way that one's people think they themselves want to do what one commands them to do."
That is the ultimate mastery of psychological formlessness. You don't push against a wall, you guide the water. She stayed a step ahead of their desires, adapting to their resistance, shaping her decrees so they felt entirely organic to the Russian people. Because the people didn't feel coerced by a rigid foreign ideology, they had nothing solid to push back against.
We also see this concept of yielding as a defense mechanism utilized on a national cultural scale in the text, specifically looking at Japan in 1577.
The historical account of João Rodrigues, a Portuguese priest who traveled to Japan during this era, is incredibly revealing. Rodrigues arrived fully expecting to encounter a hostile, closed society resistant to foreign influence.
Instead, he was flabbergasted by what he saw. He walked the streets of Japanese cities and saw citizens enthusiastically wearing imported Portuguese clothing. They were walking around with Catholic rosary beads around their necks, carrying crosses at their hips, seemingly adopting foreign customs wholesale.
To an outsider like Rodrigues, it looked like cultural capitulation. It looked like a weak culture that was just yielding, allowing itself to be easily colonized by Western influence without a fight.
But the sources reveal the brilliance of this maneuver. The Japanese enthusiasm for trying on foreign customs wasn't capitulation, it was essentially a costume. It was a cultural fashion to be donned and doffed at will.
By appearing completely susceptible, fascinated, and adaptable, the Japanese leadership effectively seduced the Portuguese. The Westerners were lulled into a false sense of security, believing they were achieving a bloodless cultural conquest.
They felt no need to launch a violent, expensive military invasion to force the Japanese into submission, because the Japanese already seemed to be yielding.
But the yield was an illusion. By doing this, Japan protected its deep, underlying cultural core from actual military destruction. They gave the aggressive, heavily armed Westerners nothing rigid to hit. Think about other nations during the colonial era that threw up massive, rigid walls and tried to violently fight off all foreign influence.
They were often met with devastating, overwhelming force and suffered deep, permanent injuries.
Japan's cultural formlessness was their ultimate armor. They absorbed the blow by stepping backward, and when the moment was right, centuries later, they controlled their own destiny.
Which brings us to a critical clarification that must be made as we head into the final analysis of these sources. Because when you hear all this, when you hear about yielding, blending in, being like water, not taking things personally, well, there is a profound danger of misinterpreting the philosophy.
Right. Someone listening to this might think, okay, the key to life is just to be a slacker. Go with the flow, man. Whatever happens, happens. Don't push back on anything. It sounds like a kind of passive religious resignation to fate.
And that is the exact opposite of what the historical texts are arguing. It is absolutely critical to understand that formlessness is not passive. It is not weakness or resignation. It is a highly calculated, intensely predatory stance.
Predatory.
Yes. The texts explicitly warn against confusing strategic formlessness with a lazy go-with-the-flow attitude. You aren't floating aimlessly. You are assuming a strategic pose designed to achieve a very specific, aggressive end, drawing your enemies out of their fortified positions and making them exhaust their energy swinging at vapor.
This brings us to what the sources call the reversal of the law. You spend all this time dispersing yourself, acting elusive, creating an abstract pattern to confuse your opponent and protect your vulnerabilities. But formlessness is only half of the equation. When you finally recognize the moment to engage, your action must not be formless. It must be a devastatingly powerful, hyper-concentrated blow.
Disperse to survive and confuse. Concentrate to destroy. This is the brutal duality of the strategy. The text brings us back to Mao Tse-tung to explain how this operates in practice. He summarized his entire philosophy by saying, when you want to fight us, we don't let you and you can't find us. But when we want to fight you, we make sure that you can't get away.
It's terrifyingly effective.
Yeah.
You use your formlessness to scatter the enemy. You frustrate them until they break their own rigid formations into small, isolated units trying to chase you down. And then, once they are scattered and weak, you suddenly solidify. You hit one of those isolated units with extreme speed and absolute concentrated power.
It is the ultimate expression of the law of concentration, and it only prevails precisely because it was preceded by an extended period of formlessness. If you are always concentrated, you are a target. If you are always formless, you are ineffective. The transition between the two is where genius lies.
And the ultimate authority cited on this dynamic is the ancient Chinese military strategist, Sun Tzu, writing in the 4th century BC.
Sun Tzu's observations perfectly tie all of this together through the metaphor of water. He observed that a military force has no constant formation, just as water has no constant shape. Think about how water operates. It yields to everything. If it hits a rock, it doesn't try to bash the rock to pieces, it just flows around it.
It seeps under doors. It takes the exact shape of whatever container you pour it into. It seems completely ungraspable and entirely passive.
Yet it is the most powerful force on Earth. Because when water accumulates, when it finds the right channel and concentrates its mass and momentum, it ceases to be a gentle, yielding stream. It becomes a tsunami.
It can shatter concrete, carve canyons out of solid rock, and wipe entire fortified cities off the map.
Sun Tzu writes, the ability to gain victory by changing and adapting according to the opponent is called genius.
Genius lies in the adaptation. It doesn't lie in having the perfect original plan. It lies in having the fluid, unegoic response to the terrain as it actually exists in front of you, rather than the terrain you wish existed.
And that requires a constant active engagement with reality, stripped of all the comforting delusions that rigid armor provides.
So what does this all mean? What an immense, counterintuitive journey we've taken through these historical and philosophical sources today. We started with the visceral shock of Jowler, the mastiff, who realized that losing his physical form, his ears, actually made him an invincible fighter.
We examined the deep biological trap of the heavily armored, slow-moving, doomed brontosaurus.
We witnessed the slow-motion tragedy of Sparta, a society that sacrificed all human vitality to build a perfect military shell, only to be corroded and destroyed from the inside by the fluid, chaotic, uncontainable power of Athenian money.
We explored the expansive, mind-encircling, non-linear tactics of the game of Go and how they dismantle linear aggression.
We looked at the survival instincts of Baron James Rothschild effortlessly surfing through violent regime changes and the brilliant, improvisational, egoless leadership of Catherine the Great. Every single example, from biology to warfare to psychology, points to the exact same underlying truth.
That trying to freeze the world in place, trying to build an impenetrable wall against change, is the one guaranteed way to ensure your own destruction. The fortress is, and always has been, a trap.
If you weigh yourself down with inflexible habits, unchangeable beliefs, and a desperate need to defend your ego, you will eventually lumber around until you go extinct. The lesson is to be like a slippery ball. Be like Mercury. Be elusive, so your enemies have nothing solid to attack.
But as we close this deep dive, there is one final, deeply provocative thought that emerges from the source's assertion about the evolution of conflict. The text notes a historical trend. Human creations inevitably evolve toward abstraction. Over centuries, we moved from two-dimensional, heavy infantry land warfare to the shifting, fluid lines of naval warfare, to the vaporous war of detachment in the deserts, and finally into the third dimension, the completely bodiless realm of the mind.
The psychological warfare, the propaganda, the encirclement of the intellect, commerce, strategy, and conflict have now migrated almost entirely into this abstract, invisible space. But this raises an urgent, almost existential question for our modern era. If true power and survival require formlessness, if they require you to leave no tracks, to have no fixed identity, to be ungraspable, well, what does the next evolution of your own formlessness actually look like in a digital age?
We live in a world where everything you say, every preference you click, every opinion you express, every photo you take is recorded, categorized, and stored on a server forever. The internet is the ultimate, inescapable, rigid record of all your past forms.
It forces us to ask, how do you remain unfathomable today? How do you play the chameleon and adapt to new circumstances when there's a permanent, easily searchable track of exactly who you were 10 years ago? In a modern culture that aggressively demands you brand yourself, that demands you declare a fixed identity and stick to it publicly, perhaps the ultimate, most difficult act of power is finding a way to remain a vapor in the machine.
How do you remain water in a world that is desperately trying to freeze you in place?
That is a challenge that will definitely stick with you long after this discussion ends. You buy a house, you build a fence, you armor up, but maybe it's time to start looking at where your walls are making you slow. We want to warmly thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material today. We invite you to stay curious, to question your comforting rituals, and above all, keep adapting.